So this is going to be a really important video about the Constitution and this authoritarian Trump administration. But before I get to the specific topic, let me say this. Those of you who know me, you know what I think about Donald Trump, okay? I don't hide my feelings about this guy. He is a detestable, loathsome piece of shit. He is a criminal who deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life. Anyone else who had done what Donald Trump has done would be in prison right now, and they would remain in prison until their natural death. That is what I think, that is where Donald Trump should be. It is an outrage. It is an affront to the Constitution itself that this man is president. He is flatly prohibited by the Constitution, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, from serving as president. He never even should have been allowed to run a second time. So that's what I think of him. And he is an authoritarian thug, a wannabe dictator. And that is how he is governing. And so that's what I think of this dirtbag. That said, however, I have cautioned people from even before him taking office. I said, look, one thing we also know about Donald Trump is he is a pathological liar. You will not find anyone in world history who is a bigger liar than Donald Trump. He lies about virtually everything. So one thing we should not do is react to everything he says as if it's true. Just because he says he's going to do something doesn't mean that he will. And even if he said that he did something, that doesn't mean that he actually did. So we need to, take what he says with not only a grain of salt, but really a pound of salt. Okay, and let's actually see what he does and not just react hysterically to what he says, even when what he says is really objectively bad, as is most of what he says. Now, what I want to talk specifically about here today is something that was said yesterday about an executive order that he supposedly issued, or that he did issue, which I'm going to get to. So, and I'm going to play a video about exactly what was said. And it was a comment made by one of his administration lackeys. I don't even honestly know who this guy is. But standing right next to Donald Trump, he talked about this executive order that Trump had signed and claimed that it reestablishes the long-standing principle that the president and the attorney general are the final word for the United States about what the law is. All right. And people, rightly reacted with outrage to that, because that's not what the Constitution says. That is the words of a wannabe dictator to say something like that. And so there were a lot of people freaking out on social media. I've seen a lot of posts on it on various platforms. I've seen people on YouTube posting videos about this, freaking out about it. But the executive order is not what people think that it is. Because once again, as is usually the case, people react to what they say about the executive order, what Donald Trump says he did by executive order, or in this case, what this lackey says Trump did by executive order. But nobody ever takes the time to read the damn executive order. And when you read it, as with many other executive orders, it doesn't do what they seem to imply that it did. Okay? So that's what I want to deal with here. So let's begin with what was said. So take a look at this video.
Lastly, we have another executive order that President Trump signed relating to independent agencies. This executive order would establish important oversight functions in the Office of Management and Budget and its subsidiary office, OIRA, supervising independent agencies and many of their actions, and also reestablishes the longstanding norm that only the President or the Attorney General can speak for the United States when stating an opinion as to what the law is.
All right, so that sounds really, really bad, to say that only the president or the attorney general can speak for the United States about what the law is. Because that is completely contrary to the Constitution and to long-standing constitutional law. That statement itself, to people who have read probably the most famous and fundamental Supreme Court decision in history, Marbury versus Madison, written by Chief Justice John Marshall in 1803, recognize that that language, that this piece of garbage standing next to Trump, what he said sounds very much like Marbury versus Madison, except for the fact that it's the court, the judicial branch, and specifically as a final word, the Supreme Court, that gets to decide, what the law says, right? Not the president. In fact, the most famous line from that case is this, quote, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department," meaning the judicial branch, "to say what the law is." That is from 1803. That is the most fundamental constitutional law ruling from the Supreme Court in our history. And so that statement from this, this scumbag standing next to Trump sounds very much like that statement from Marbury versus Madison, but instead of the courts get to say what the law is, this guy is saying that it's Trump and his attorney general who get to say what the law is. Well, that is absolutely not the case. So people are rightfully upset about this. But let's take a look at what the executive order actually says, because that's not what the executive order actually says. So surprise, surprise, these people are grossly mischaracterizing what their own executive order says. And when you read it, the executive order is actually a big pile of nothing. So let's get into that executive order. So here's the executive order on the White House website. It's titled Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies, and it's dated February 18th, 2025. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's full of fluff and definitions and other things that really don't get to the heart of this executive order. But I'm going to read a little bit about what they describe in the beginning as the purpose, the policy objective and purpose of the executive order, and then I'm going to read the what's really the heart of this executive order. So let's begin with Section 1, Policy and Purpose. The Constitution vests, and by the way, what they say here in this Policy and Purpose section is constitutionally accurate. Okay, so let's read it. The Constitution vests all executive power in the President and charges him with faithfully executing the laws. That is correct. Since it would be impossible for the President to single-handedly perform all the executive business of the federal government, the Constitution also provides for subordinate officers to assist the President in his executive duties. Correct. In the exercise of their often considerable authority, these executive branch officials remain subject to the President's ongoing supervision and control. Correct. The President, in turn, is regularly elected by and accountable to the American people. This is one of the structural safeguards, along with the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches, regular elections for the Congress, and an independent judiciary whose judges are appointed by the President by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, by which the framers created a government accountable to the American people. Correct. However, previous administrations have allowed so-called independent regulatory agencies to operate with minimal presidential supervision. These regulatory agencies currently exercise substantial executive authority without sufficient accountability to the President and through him to the American people. Moreover, these regulatory agencies have been permitted to promulgate significant regulations without review by the President. Okay, let's deal with this paragraph here. Now, this idea of independent regulatory agencies. Now, they refer to this as so-called independent regulatory agencies because there really is no such thing as an independent agency in government, right? Every agency of the government falls within the executive branch, which means it falls under the authority of the President. So there is no such thing as an independent agency. But you hear it all the time. You hear that, for example, that the Department of Justice is independent. Well, it's not. Constitutionally speaking, it's not. It is subordinate to the president, and the president, whether you like it or not, has the right to control the Department of Justice. He can go right in there and micromanage cases if he wants to. Now, that is, by our tradition, completely improper, and we don't want a president to be able to do that. But from a constitutional point of view, he can, because the Department of Justice is not independent. Anyway, so the point of the matter is, from a constitutional point of view, there is no such thing as an independent agency. All right. Anyway, I'm not going to read any more of this because I'm already going longer here than I wanted to. The point is that the reason they have issued this executive order is because they think that these regulatory agencies within the executive branch have too much independent authority, and that they are promulgating rules and making decisions without review by the president or whoever the president might, want to oversee these things. And so the purpose of this executive order is to sort of rein in and exert more control over these independent, or these so-called independent agencies, which really don't exist. There are no independent agencies. But to exert more control over these agencies and departments within the executive branch. And you can debate whether that's a good idea, but the president absolutely has the authority to do that if he wants to. Now we go to the heart of this executive order, which is found in this section 7, rules of conduct guiding federal employees' interpretation of the law. The president and the attorney general, subject to the president's supervision and control, shall provide authoritative interpretations of law for the executive branch. The president and the attorney general's opinions on questions of law are controlling on all employees in the conduct of their official duties. No employee of the executive branch acting in their official capacity may advance an interpretation of the law as the position of the United States that contravenes the president or the attorney general's opinion on a matter of law, including but not limited to the issuance of regulations, guidance, and positions advanced in litigation, unless authorized to do so by the president or in writing by the attorney general. Okay, so as bad as you may think that sounds, there's actually nothing wrong with it. All they're saying here with this executive order is that within the executive branch, in interpretation of laws in the executive branch, it is the opinion of the president and the attorney general on what the law says that guides the executive branch, and that no one within the executive branch is allowed to have an interpretation of law that contradicts that of the president or the attorney general. Now, what's important here is that this only applies to the executive branch. And what you need to understand here, and I'll get to the court, this is where I'll bring the court in. It's not just the court that interprets the law. In fact, we all interpret the law. Okay, the courts only get involved in interpreting what the law means when there is a conflict, when there is a case brought to the court because people disagree about what the law actually says. So a law is written and passed by Congress, right? It is then subject to interpretation by lots of different parties. The president and executive branch agencies who are whose job it is to enforce the law, by necessity have to read the law and try to ascertain for themselves what exactly does it mean so that they can attempt to enforce it correctly. Okay? Not only that, but people, regular citizens and businesses who are impacted by that law have to read the law themselves and decide for themselves what they think the law means. I mean, that's what lawyers are for. I mean, that's the job of lawyers. So say you want to start a business, okay? And there's lots of laws, state and federal laws, that may impact your business. Well, you're going to hire a lawyer to advise you about what those laws mean so that you can comply with them correctly, right? So it's not just even the government, it's you and your lawyer reading the laws passed by Congress or your state legislature to try to interpret what you think the law means so that you can try to set your business up in accordance with the law. Now, what happens if a government regulatory agency, which is charged with enforcing that law, sees it differently than you and your lawyer? And they try to, fine you or tell you, well, you can't do that, or to shut you down or something. Well, then you have a conflict with the government. And so maybe the government takes you to court, or maybe they try to fine you or tell you can't do something, and you file a lawsuit. You take the government to court and say, screw that, I'm not paying this fine, or you can't tell me you're reading the law wrong. I am perfectly within my rights under the law to do this. Let's go to court. That's when the court gets involved. Then the court interprets what the law means, and it is the court's interpretation that governs. They have the final say, but they only get involved when there's a conflict among different parties, who are litigants in a lawsuit brought before them. When that happens, it's the court's job to, as Justice Marshall said in 1803, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. But that only ever comes into play in context of litigation. So my point is that not just the courts, but everyone who is impacted by a law exercises their own independent judgment and interpretation about what the law says. And that's no different with the president and his executive branch. So by this executive order, the Trump administration is saying, look, to all these agencies in the executive branch, it is the president and the attorney general who are going to make the decision about what the law says in terms of our enforcement of federal law. Now, the problem is that the language that Trump's little lackey here in that video clip, the language he used made it sound like they were the final say. Trump and his attorney general are the final say as to what the law is for the United States, not the courts. But that's not what the executive order at all says. Nothing in this executive order, they specifically say in the executive order that it applies only to the executive branch. So if in the enforcement of federal law, some agency takes their orders as to what the law means from the president or the attorney general, and they enforce the law with that interpretation, and then there is a lawsuit stemming from that. Someone sues or the government sues some party, and they end up before the court. At that point, it's the court. Again, per Marbury versus Madison, going all the way back to 1803, it is the court's interpretation that is the final say on what the law is. Okay, but up until then, up until the court weighs in, the president is perfectly entitled to tell his executive branch that it is my interpretation or that of my attorney general to set the policy for the executive branch about what some particular aspect of the law means. Until we get to court and a court weighs in. At that point, then it's the court. Now, if we reach that point and we go to court on something and the court interprets the law adversely to what the Trump administration says, if the Trump administration says, screw you, I'm not abiding by your ruling, I think I'm the final word about the law, not you, court, well, then we have a different problem. Then we, in fact, have a constitutional crisis. We will at that point have a rogue president who is clearly violating separation of powers and defying a court order. But that's not what is being said in this executive order. Maybe one day they'll do that, but that is not what they are saying here in this executive order. And let's think about it too. Remember what an executive order is. An executive order is only an order given by the president to his executive branch. That's what an executive order is. And keep this in mind too. The Constitution doesn't say anything about executive orders. You will not find a section of the Constitution dealing with executive orders. So just because the president says something is an executive order doesn't give it any special power. Because for example, as I said, a lot of people were overreacting to this executive order. Here's one example. This is a post I saw, and this has thousands of likes and shares and all this stuff. And they're sharing a video clip that I just played you of Trump and this douchebag talking about the executive order. And this person wrote, "Trump has escalated. He is now attempting to eliminate the judicial branch of the United States government through narrative sleight of hand." This is hysterical overreaction to what this executive order actually was. He's not eliminating the judicial branch with his executive order. In fact, there is, and I remember, I began this video by telling you what I think of Donald Trump. He's an authoritarian, fascist, criminal piece of shit. And so much of what he does is illegal and unconstitutional. But nothing in that executive order is illegal or unconstitutional. None of it. In fact, it's really sort of a meaningless executive order. This is one of those things, because my point was that I was making a moment ago, is that there's nothing special about an executive order. It's not in the Constitution. It's just an order that he gives to his executive branch. This could have been an email, right? He could have just sent an email to his different cabinet secretaries saying, "Hey, I don't want any more independent interpretation of the law. If there's some question about what the law is, you contact my office or the Attorney General. We are the final say within the executive branch about the interpretation of law. I just want to make that clear. Tell that to your departments." Okay? It could have been an email. Just because it's an executive order doesn't wrap it up in any special legal or constitutional significance. So this person saying, now he's attempting to eliminate the judicial branch of the United States government through executive order. Okay, he can't do any such thing through executive order. And imagine if he tried to. Imagine if he tried to eliminate the courts by executive order. Would the courts just say, "Oh, okay. Give me a break. Give me a break." It's just, we don't need, excuse me, still battling the bronchitis. We don't need to so overreact to everything that Trump says and does. That's my point. Anyway, like I said, this could have been an email. Anything that Donald Trump says to his executive branch, any order he gives them in any way could be considered an executive order. An email, he could essentially, issue an executive order by tweet. Any order he gives to his executive branch is by definition an executive order. Just because you give it an executive order number and you put it on the website and you dress it up with all this legalese language doesn't imbue it with any more legal or constitutional authority. An executive order is not law. It never has been. It never will be, because presidents have no authority to make law. Only Congress does. So by definition, nothing that Trump does is a law. Doesn't matter if you call it executive order or not. At most, all an executive order is an order to his executive branch. And it's only valid and legal if it is rightly made pursuant to the president's inherent constitutional authority, or if it's authorized by statute passed by Congress. All right? So that's what you need to know about executive orders. Don't hyperventilate about all this crap. And by the way, so many people fall into this, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with this executive order. Now you can debate as a policy matter whether some of these, agencies within the executive branch should be given more independent authority. That's a policy consideration, okay? Donald Trump wants to micromanage. That's basically what they're saying here. Trump and his attorney general want to micromanage the various departments of the executive branch. You might not think that's a good idea, but constitutionally, he has every right to do that. That said, however, we don't have to blow these things up into more of an issue than they are. And so many people fall for this. I saw a post by Harvard professor Lawrence Tribe, and he posted that video clip. And he made some comment about, this is contrary to Marbury versus Madison in 1808. This is flatly unconstitutional or something along those lines. But he was reacting to what this guy said in the video. What he said means nothing. What matters is the executive order. Now, again, if it ever gets to a point where Trump and this guy or his attorney general or whoever try to say that we don't have to abide by a court ruling because Donald Trump is the final say about what the law is, then we're in a different place. But as of right now, the executive order is perfectly proper and constitutional. What this guy said sounds authoritarian and sounds unconstitutional, but what the guy said is not the executive order. Anyways, people just should stop falling for this stuff. There's enough bad going on that is really, really bad, like sincerely, truly bad, that we should be focused on. Not this nonsense that, is just blown way out of proportion. Anyways, I hope this all makes sense, and I hope nobody takes anything that I've said here in this video as a defense of Donald Trump, because it's not. It's just the simple fact that this is actually, not an unconstitutional executive order. It's actually really kind of a meaningless executive order. Like I said, it could have been an email. It's not that big of a deal. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.